Santa said that we're all related. But I never seen him at Aunt Dolores' for Christmas. What is he talking about?
Why, he was talking about evolution and the common ancestor. What is the common ancestor, you may ask? Well, all life forms on Earth share one common ancestor with which life on this planet began. From that organism, new organisms formed and developed. Over time, new species began to evolve. For example, all modern birds share one common ancestor that possess similar structures and characteristics that birds do now. That organism's offspring developed into different species of birds over long periods of time. After millions of years of evolution, we now have the species of birds we see every day. The same sort of thing happened with humans. We're all related to one common ancestral species that had the earliest versions of the structures we possess today.
Oh, I get it a little bit, but I'm still confused.
You know what? I saw a video about this that could explain it a bit further. It was done by 5 students at Father Judge High School. Bring me your laptop electronic book, and I'll bring it up.
Breaking news, guys. This just in. All humans can now trace their heritage back to one common ancestor, mitochondria Eve.
Whenever an organism has offspring, it passes on genetic information to these offspring.
This genetic code isn't just directly passed on, however. During the zygote formation of organisms that reproduce sexually, some DNA is taken from the mother and some is taken from the father. However, mitochondrial DNA is taken only from the mother. So if you trace back your family lineage purely through mitochondrial DNA, you would go back to mitochondrial Eve.
See, this is where mitochondrial Eve comes in. Since the human species, known as Homo sapien, has evolved from other human subspecies, we can deduce that there were the first generation of Homo sapien.
Because mitochondrial DNA is passed down from women, we can trace the mitochondrial DNA of all modern humans back to the first generation, some of the first organisms that were anatomically similar to us.
So the term mitochondrial Eve refers to this woman, or small group of women, that we can trace back our mitochondrial DNA back to, since the mitochondrial DNA mutates at a very slow rate once every 3,500 years. This is something that is very possible and has been done by evolutionary biologists examining the fossil record. Hence, the first small group of Homo sapien are ancestors from which we all descended from.
This is our common ancestor. Let's demonstrate this with a chart. This person has mitochondrial DNA. If we look at his parents, we see that his mother passed on the mitochondrial DNA to him. If we take a further look at his mother, we see that she received mitochondrial DNA from her mother, and the same applies to the father. If we take this all the way back to the development of Homo sapiens, we can see that the first generation passes their mitochondrial DNA right down the tree.
The concept of a common ancestor has been around for centuries. It is something that has been thought about dating back to ancient civilizations, such as Greeks, Romans, and Chinese. But mitochondrial Eve theory can attribute to its scientific roots to Darwin's theory of evolution. With evolution, Darwin introduces a basis for common ancestor. He described a process known as descent with modification. As organisms have offspring, natural selection will slowly modify them. This can be applied to show that an original common ancestor can produce the variety of life on Earth.
Darwin, however, did not touch the subject of human evolution in the origin of species, to avoid creating any more unnecessary controversy over evolution. However, in his later publication, The Descent of Man, Darwin expressed his view humans had evolved from prior species, and that mental functions such as morality and intelligence are caused by the degree of adaptation in the human brain.
The debate over human origins and common ancestry continued. One of the most important discoveries in the history of biology would further the view that a human ancestor existed. This was the discovery of genetic inheritance by the monk Gregor Mendel. This gave natural selection the genetic variation necessary for evolution, which led to it becoming widely accepted. And because of this, the interest in human common ancestry grew.
In the past century, advances in technology have allowed us to gather a vast array of evidence for a human common ancestor, from fossils to genetics. In the 1980s, advances in the field of DNA sequencing gave birth to our modern understanding of mitochondrial DNA. It was this time when geneticists Alan Wilson, Rebecca Kahn, and Mark Stoeckning formulated the mitochondrial Eve theory.
Since then, it has been the subject of much debate. Well, but who is mitochondrial Eve? When was she alive? And what else do we know about her?
Good questions. Let's keep watching.
Mitochondrial Eve was not one person. It was a collective term for a small group of female Homo sapiens who passed on their mitochondrial DNA to modern humans. When mitochondrial Eve is referred to as she or her, it is important to remember that this is referencing more than one person. Also, many people get the common misconception that they were the only females around at the time. The correct statement is that they were the only females to produce an unbroken family line down to current humans.
Mitochondrial Eve would have lived during a genetic bottleneck, a time when the human population was very small, allowing her descendants to take over the human-like species and colonize the rest of the world.
Also, mitochondrial Eve is not to be mistaken with our most recent common ancestor, the MRCA, which is just what it says, the most recent organism that we all descend from. This person lived surprisingly recent, as late as only 5,000 years ago.
The time at which mitochondrial Eve existed is one of considerable debates among evolutionary biologists and paleontologists. Fossils such as those of the Squamble and Kafze hominids place a boundary on her existence, however. It must have been no earlier than 90,000 years before Common Era. Some estimates place Eve as existed over 200,000 years ago.
According to the leading hypothesis, mitochondrial Eve originated out of Africa after modern humans developed there. They fanned out over the continent, into the Middle East, and into Europe and Asia.
Well, that's awesome. But how do we know all this, though? Is it all true?
More great questions. Let's continue.
First of all, the fossil record, the collection of fossils discovered by humans, function as an evolutionary timeline and provides some of the most direct evidence for evolution of humans. In terms of human evolution, fossils have pointed to ancient human-like species originating in Africa, as mitochondrial Eve theory predicts. In particular, one of the earliest human species of the genus Homo is the Homo habilis, which lived over 1 million years ago.
More fossil evidence comes from the fossil of Homo sapien in Altu. This species was very similar to modern human, lived in Africa, and lived approximately 130,000 years ago. In genetics, there is even more evidence.
The regional differences in genetic diversity point to a human ancestor in Africa. Human populations in different regions of the world have different adaptations. For example, humans living in the Gobi Desert developed an epicanthic fold in the eyes. An explanation is given by mitochondrial Eve. Since humans originated in Africa with mitochondrial Eve, different groups migrating different ways would experience the founder effect, evolution due to a change in environment. Further evidence comes from chromosome 2. All species of hominids, the great apes, have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans, on the other hand, have only 23. This points to two chromosomes becoming fused at some point in human evolution.
If we compare human and chimpanzee genomes, around 70% of the human genome is similar to the genome of a chimpanzee. Only 600 coding protein genes of human DNA are similar to a chimpanzee's. We share plenty of our genome with other organisms too. For example, 5% of the human genome is also shared with the genomes of dogs and mice. In the genomes of mice, 92% of the genes are shared with the human genes. The genes of yeast are also 26% similar with human genes, and 18% of the genes of a common breed are similar with the humans.
This has been the Father Judge Biological News Team's presentation on the common ancestor and mitochondrial Eve theory. I'm Greg.
I'm Brendan.
And I'm Dan.
I'm Andrew.
And we're signing off.
Wow, the common ancestor is such an interesting topic. I learned a lot today. Thanks, Greg. Grandpa.
No problem, Skipper. Now you better go on up to bed.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
Good night, Dan.